Suspended by Alistair Wilkinson. Chapter 1. No one knew what caused the splash. It was generally agreed that something had happened in the Humber and that something had caused a huge flood. But that was about it as far as agreement went, because very quickly people had grown fascinated. Meteors, comets, planes and aliens had all been blamed. Ships bearing the latest sonar equipment had swept the estuary for years but found nothing. So theories moved on to weapons tests, exploding submarines, earthquakes and the wrath of God. Some blamed the French, but then some always do. Some set up camp on the east walkway of the Humber Bridge and just watched. Colourful pod-like tents and black cameras clung to the concrete and metal like voyeuristic limpets that hoped to record history or even a new dawn. They died first. In the beginning this was newsworthy. Humberside became the centre of the world. The slow, murky waters of the Humber, however, remained nothing but slow and murky. The camps melted away and so did the attention. And for a while, for lots of years, there were no more deaths. It was left to splashland to make sure that Humberside was not forgotten. Tourists, conspiracy theorists, sightseers and thrill-seekers came in their droves, and splashland grew and grew. Humberside twitched. It had grown reliant on the tourist industry, and by the June of 2007 the deaths had started again, along with something new. The dogs weren't quite right. Not all of them all of the time, but certainly most of them most of the time. No one could explain it. The dogs were just not quite right. Tilda made her way through the crops, head and tail down. She knew he was out there somewhere, following like he always did. He was a monster of a mongrel, part pit bull, part bastard and part something else altogether, with blazing red eyes and a dark brown coat that shimmered black in the sun. Dog followed and watched. He didn't need to stay close. James made sure of that. James was 35 years old and 3 months an orphan. And he wasn't at home in the fields. He blundered his way through the crop, walking his dog because he knew that he should. He looked down at Tilda. He didn't know the breed of his dog. He didn't like to think of Tilda as his dog. She had belonged to his parents, and so now she belonged to him, like the house or the kitchen or the fridge. He didn't know that she was a border collie, but he was pretty sure that she wasn't a fridge. He did know that she needed to walk, and so walk they did. This daily determination wasn't doing much for Tilda. She knew that it was a chore for her new master. If she'd been able, she might have told him not to bother. But we'll never know if she would, because she couldn't. In the end, she was just a dog. Somewhere deep down, James realised a little of Tilda's disenchantment, and so today he decided on a change. It had been a very wet spring, and this hot June Sunday was the first day in weeks that the mud hadn't sucked and pulled at his boots. They had left the narrow footpath that bordered the fields to walk through the mini jungle of whatever it was that was growing here. It was yellow. Their fleeting wake in the yellow crops pointed north to the Humber estuary, 2 fields and a huge car park away. Rank upon rank of sun-mirrored windscreens formed a shining road to Splashland, home to the tall shaft of Zoom and the towers of Tsunami, a ride based on a small-scale version of the Humber Bridge. The massive towers of the real thing to the west were an angular grey silhouette against the blue sky. Tilda wasn't happy amongst the crops. She couldn't see very much, and running was hard in the tangle of stalks and stems. She could no longer smell dog, so she had the odd sprint up and down the tractor tracks, but James wasn't watching, so she gave up. Passing through a gap in a hedge and into a new field, James saw a tree in the far southwestern corner. He decided that that would be far enough. Once they reached the tree, they could have a sit down and then head home. The bright sun had promised that today's walk would be a good one. It had lied. They slogged across the heat in the new field. As he came close to the tree, he saw that it was pathetic. Just a skeletal collection of dry twigs, a dying hand, weak and brittle in the faint breeze. They pressed on, quickly covering the distance. They had made it. The day's goal was achieved. Unfortunately, the tree offered little shade and no cover. A young man, horribly exposed, was sitting at the base of the trunk. He had probably bought the magazine from the local shop, from the local woman behind the counter. It would have cost him money and pride, and then he had taken it to a secluded corner of a secluded field, his eyes darting this way and that, always fearing that someone might see him. And when he had reached his spot, he had taken his risk. Tilda watched as the magazine slipped from extended, bare-to-the-ankles legs and fell to the ground. James tried not to look, but he couldn't help it. His eyes were drawn, lids pulled apart like 2 spotlights on a stage exposing an audience who really are in their underwear. The young man was caught red-handed, holding the smoking gun. James yanked his eyes away, and they dropped to the ground and the magazine. The images were censored by the sun's glare. The harsh reflections forced James to look away and back to the young man. Their gazes met. 4 impossibly round eyes stared in horror. This time, James couldn't tear his eyes from that embarrassed, terrified face. "Sorry," said James. He didn't move. He just stood there. And stood there. The young man said nothing and begged with his eyes, with his entire being, to be left alone forever. Finally, James turned his intractable body to leave. In his desperation to be away, he headed south, away from his home, through another hedgerow and into another field. He walked quickly, trying not to look hurried, trying not to make it a big deal. Tilda followed. Barbara struggled along the edge of a field. Her wild blonde hair concealed the mobile phone held to her ear. "Get outside," he said. "Fresh air will do you good," he said. "If that's doctoring, I'm in the wrong job." Barbara's mobile phone was very nice, top of the range and filled with all manner of functions that she had no idea how to use and no inclination to find out. It was chocolate brown, shaped like a large pill, and, right now, the only solid thing about her. Barbara was melting. "Did you tell the doctor about your hay fever?" asked Diane, the voice on the phone. "That'd be far too sensible," said Barbara, "and the car's miles away. I don't think I can make it." "What about your magic pills from that dodgy homeopath?" "She's not dodgy, and they do work." "Sounds like it. I've forgotten them. That was a bit silly." "Yes. Well, the doc's right. You do need to get out more. What's it like there, anyway?" "Hang on." Barbara sighed, and her nose bubbled as she held the phone up and pressed a button. Something clicked. "I've sent you a pic." "Doesn't look that bad. Looks pretty and full of agriculture." "Agriculture's no use to me until it's in a tin." "Funny," Diane replied. She sighed. "You're too closed to new experiences. You spend all your time trapped inside. You need to live a bit." "I need tissues." Barbara rushed her words before they were overridden by a loud, wet sneeze. "I bet you look lovely." James fled. The young man would dread ever seeing him again. James dreaded ever seeing the young man again. He lived in a small community. It was bound to happen. He and Tilda strode through yet another field. The two of them walked like he had intended them to walk for the last 2 months, but never had. Tilda enjoyed it. It felt purposeful, like they were getting somewhere. Memories of thrown sticks surfaced in her mind. Then James stopped. Tilda looked to her master. He looked north toward home, beyond the cackling tree, to a glass tower glittering in the sun as it poked above a large square bank of conifers, and beyond that the steel and garish plastic tumult of Splashland. He could just about make out the screams from the rides as they sped up and down and around and around. Gathering himself, James headed back towards the footpath he wished he had never left. Rejoining the path, he made for home, his head down. The ghostly sticks faded from Tilda's mind. As they passed level with the tree, now 100 metres to their left, they heard a sneeze, a loud, wet lip flapper of a sneeze. It came from over the hedge that bordered the footpath. He took a peek. "I bet I don't," said Barbara, her voice damp and heavy. To James, she glided along the edge of the field, her left hand held delicately to her ear, and her right smoothing her face. He watched her and remembered. He remembered her blue eyes, her delicate nose, and her mouth that didn't smile. He remembered how short she was, and how blonde her closely cropped hair had been. Now her hair was darker and long, and she wore it tied back. Most of it had managed to escape. There was too much hair, James quickly decided. Halfway down the back is a lot closer to the ground for some. They both arrived at the gap in the hedge, and stood and stared for a stupefied moment. "I'll call you back," she said into her hand. "You're hanging up?" said Diane. "Why?" "There's an old friend." She closed the phone and stuffed it into her pocket. She could only just see James through the snot and haze, but she recognised him straight away. He was smiling at her. He had heard her say old friend. James was tall, taller than she remembered, dark and just a little overweight. His eyes were a deep and trusting brown. Had he always had such a small chin? Still, a small chin's nothing compared to looking like phlegm in a puddle, she thought. She needn't have worried, because James was actually thinking that she looked like butter left in the sun. A bit yucky, but still very creamy. "Hi," she said. Her voice gurgled. "Hello," he replied. Silence. Birds chirruped. James was sure they were laughing. Are you, okay? He asked, knowing that she wasn't, knowing that she'd say she was. Fine, yes, fine, she said. Thank you, she added. It's Barbara, isn't it? Yes. She tried to look at him more clearly, but the clear sky, loose hair, and swimming eyes made it too difficult. And you're Jim. It's James. You sat near me in a lesson. Several, I think. I remember French. You were 3 tables across, and that's a freakish memory. It could have been 2, James panicked. Or 4. Why are you being weird? I'm not, I don't think. We sat near each other in most lessons. I know, he said, a little too quickly. I just remember French because... James ran out of words. He wanted to tell her he remembered French because of the way the afternoon sun flooded into the huge windows of the porter cabin and lit up her hair like gold. Instead, he just stared at her stupidly. Because? Because it was on a Friday, and I couldn't wait for the week to finish. Good a reason as any, I suppose. She moved through the gap and onto the path. The awkwardness of the situation made her stand uncomfortably. Do you mind if I walk with you? He asked. No. They walked in silence for a few steps. Are you still Barbara Bean? She checked his face for any sign of a smirk. Yes, James, I am still Miss Bean. And who's this? Barbara pointed to Tilda. Tilda. Hello, Tilda, she said to Tilda. What kind of a dog is she? She said to James. A brown one. They both laughed. You're wrong, said Barbara. Really? She's brown and black. They laughed again and continued along the path. As Barbara laughed, her turbid face shone and her smile was devastating. And then she sneezed again. And again. And again. James looked down on her as her sneezes doubled her over. And then he did something he didn't do. He asked her back to his place. Listen, you look terrible, he started. Thanks. Why don't you come back to my house and get a drink and a little time away from nature? I only live a couple of fields away. Barbara looked dubious. James smiled. She stared up at James, and now she did something that she didn't do. Okay, she said, smiling. And that was a good thing, because otherwise they wouldn't have gone on to save the world. They carried on north along the path. Tilda, sensing the joy of the new, and Dog momentarily forgotten, danced around them. We were happy to let her.